Greetings, everybody. Welcome to the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. I'm Jonathan Brown, the director. And we're very fortunate to have today a presentation by someone I've learned a lot from over the years. Someone I've learned a great deal from over the years, Ovamir Anjum, who's the Imam Khattab Endowed Chair of Islamic Studies at the University of Toledo, Tayatullah in Arabic, although this is the one in Ohio, not in Spain. He's the author. His book, Politics, Law, and Community in Islamic Thought from Cambridge University Press is an excellent, excellent book. I'd really recommend it for anybody who's interested in political theory and law and notions of law and community in the Islamic tradition. It's a very good book. And unlike a lot of scholars, in Islamic studies, Ovamir is also, a living philosopher in the sense that he kind of engages this stuff as living issues, trying to think about how Muslims think about these issues today. And he's recently finished a book which took him 10 years. I'm a slow reader myself, so I understand. No, he translated a book called, it's Madarij as-Salikin, which is a very famous Sufi manual from the 14th century, translated in English. And he's also working on a monograph on issues of violence and legitimacy raised by the phenomenon of Isis, which he will be talking about today. Thank you very much, Ovamir. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for having me and for being here. I'll spare you the preliminaries and get right to it. ISIS, as we know, is an armed group that can be described as terrorist. That is, it uses violence as a political and psychological tool. It's territorial, unlike, say, al-Qaeda. It's missionary and expansionist rather than, say, nationalist. It's apocalyptic, as it gives immediate political meaning to the widely accepted end times traditions in traditions that are accepted in old Sunni Islam and otherwise. And takfiri. So these are some of the adjectives that are used.
What is takfiri?
Takfiri means one that operates on the basis of an exclusionary basis, excludes other Muslims from being part of Islam. Its material and ideological roots go back to Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist state as well as Al-Qaeda, but many analysts increasingly point out that it is more Saddam 2.0 than Al-Qaeda 2.0. Its ideological genealogy is said to include primarily not only the jihadi Salafi trend of the last quarter of the 20th century, but also Wahhabi and Salafi doctrines more generally, going all the way back to early Islam or to Ibn Taymiyyah. I explain why I think such explanations are unhelpful, but first let me state my problem more precisely. My interest is first and foremost in understanding the challenge the ISIS phenomenon poses to the Islamic tradition and the cracks in Islamic tradition or its contemporary recensions that it exposes. My chief theoretical contention is that Muslim scholars and students must understand this problem from within Islamic tradition in order to respond to it, but also to advance the tradition's capacity to the larger problem of political legitimacy and social integration plaguing Muslim societies. The first part of my talk, therefore, is an apology for why I pose the problem this way. The second part explores how to frame this problem in terms of Islamic norms, and possibly, if we ever get to the third part, and I usually don't in this kind of talk, returns to my initial question, namely, what ISIS poses and exposes, but I hope we can get to it in Q&A. The people I am addressing, first and foremost, are fellow scholars and students of Islam, both who identify as Muslims as well as those who are willing to take Islam's normative framework seriously. First, the apology. Thank you. Whenever I pose the question this way, as I did a few weeks ago in a similar lecture, the two most common objections are raised by thoughtful people, both Muslim and otherwise. First, by proposing to understand ISIS through the lens of Islamic tradition, I might be proposing that first, ISIS is somehow Islamic. That is, ISIS's violence and acts are justified by Islamic norms. And second, I'm thereby ignoring the direct and immediate role of Western imperialism, the two Gulf Wars, and the intervening sanctions on Iraq, and so on, in giving rise to ISIS. I reject both of these possible misunderstandings, though I acknowledge that their possibility exists. Let me begin by questioning the question, is ISIS Islamic? Famously articulated by Graham Wood's article in The Atlantic, What ISIS Really Wants, in March 2015. This is how the problem is presented in the media, and I do not mean only the Trump Times of the world, but also the great bastions of liberalism and objective reporting like the New York Times, where ISIS is presented as a uniquely horrifying problem, precisely because it is justified in the name of religion. As Talal Asad has argued in his On Suicide Bombing, violence that cannot be classified according to the terms that we understand especially horrifies us. To the secular mind, therefore, violence justified in the name of a religion, especially a foreign religion, is particularly horrifying, whereas violence justified in secular terms, such as national security or economic expansion or collateral damage, is understandable, if not always justified. For instance, no major sources, as far as I'm aware, question the claim by the Syrian human rights group that Assad's regime, Bashar Assad's regime, kills 7 people for every 1 person killed by ISIS, and that the number of people ISIS has killed, between 20 and 40,000, dwarfs compared to, say, the 2 American wars in the Gulf. This number dwarfs also when we compare to a similar monstrosity, Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge, which killed 1.5 to 3 million, also created directly as a result of another American war. Similarly, the secular Middle Eastern regimes, many U.S.-backed, have for decades killed and imprisoned a far greater number of people. With a few enlightening exceptions, what is implied in such analyses is that ISIS's claim to its Islamicness is somehow more fundamentally valid than, say, the KKK's claim to its Americanness. But to constantly speak of Western power or hypocrisy has become a distraction that threatens our self-understanding and the well-being, I believe, of Islamic tradition. Besides, no amount of investigation of political, economic, or social factors, necessary as it is, can do away with the moral human responsibility, something that the secular social theorists cannot quite account for, but that is the focal point for Islamic tradition. It is the focal point not only for understanding the private sphere and private judgment, but the world and God's plan in it at large, which is why the two traditions are, in some limited respects, incommensurable. My case for why ISIS, even though an abomination by any standard, is best understood from within Islamic tradition is not quite complete yet. I'm simply trying to lay out the qualifications and disclaimers. But I think the best proof is in the pudding, to which now I turn. When speaking to a wide variety of Western Muslims, the common response to the phenomenon of ISIS at the emotional level that I have found is horror and disgust. The response is slightly different in the Muslim world. The reaction to it's not fundamentally different, but there, and I spent a year teaching in the Middle East and have spent some time in South Asia, Pakistan. There are 2 additional elements that are quite pronounced in the Muslim world, which is, number 1, ISIS is not the biggest problem in the world, not our biggest problem, and therefore it doesn't appear as a sort of a crisis that it appears for Western Muslims. Secondly, there is a much greater level of disbelief or conspiracy theory, whatever, however you characterize it. But I'll set aside that for now and turn to mostly Western Muslims' concerns. Regardless, when confronted with the conduct of ISIS, the knee-jerk reaction is that such a bloodthirsty, unprincipled program of violence must be un-Islamic because the Prophet Muhammad was the mercy to all worlds and Islam is a religion of mercy. The common Muslim responses, in brief, to the phenomenon of ISIS are as follows. I'll classify them into 4. Number 1, it's ultimately a Western conspiracy. Therefore, Islam bears not only Islam, but Muslims, nobody bears any responsibility. Second, that they are a political group after power, not inspired by Islam, and certainly not adherent to Islamic norms. In other words, that because they have a political, social, economic, and so on agenda, they somehow Islam should not be brought to understand them. Third, they are more or less a natural manifestation of the Wahhabi or Salafi ideology, and fourth, that they are modern-day Kharijis. As a Western Muslim academic myself, I must admit I'm my own situatedness, yet I cannot help being alarmed by how frequent and widespread the first explanation is, meaning conspiracy theory. Despite the undoubted Western role in creating the conditions in which ISIS arose and the constant attempts to manipulate the masses at home and abroad, it is irresponsible and damaging to take comfort in the view that ISIS is not Islamic because it is a U.S.-hatched conspiracy. Conspiracy theories, fake news, and truthiness are not the preserve of Muslims alone. Of course, in a country where a majority denies unanimously established scientific facts, you should know. The tendency to prefer comforting paradigms over disturbing data, that is, to prefer truth over facts, is a general human trait, I submit, or weakness. But people's receptivity to facts ebbs and flows based on both intellectual and socio-political conditions. Allow me to shelve this problem of what we might call the epistemological crisis, although I'm not quite comfortable with this label yet, in part because I think we overuse the word crisis, and in part because what is at stake? At stake is in part social institutions and not only epistemology of how people analyze data and what's happening in the world and who is responsible for so on and so forth. The second common explanation, that the rise of ISIS is a political and hence secular phenomenon, I think makes two kinds of errors. First, at the level of social causation. Unless one is a materialist who sees ideology, religion, and culture as mere epiphenomena, one cannot use material causes to deny any role to ideas and doctrines. Second, Islamic normative tradition is as invested in judging earthly, quote-unquote, secular phenomena as it is in judging or understanding the attributes of God. Islamic law, in fact, is precisely this. The enterprise to discover divine judgment on earthly phenomena, no matter what the inspiration or intention, is what Islamic law does. And in order to make the judgment on whether an act whose agents claim Islamic grounding is in fact not permissible and evil, one must take a position vis-a-vis Islamic moral tradition, either by belonging to it or somehow taking a position, which I'll come back to later. The third is a description. That means the idea that it's a Salafi, Jihadi, and Wahhabi doctrine. It is a fine description of this doctrine or the phenomenon of ISIS, but as an explanation, I think it's trivial. That is to say that ISIS is Salafi, Jihadi, or has elements of the Wahhabi doctrine is undeniable, but it explains little. True, ISIS ideologues claim to be truly Salafi and appear to be obsessed with some of the signature Wahhabi doctrines, such as strict interpretation of Tawheed, rejection of irja, which is irja is laxity in conduct, that is laxity towards sinfulness, strict enforcement of morality, and again takfir or excommunication of its opponents, of in fact all other Muslims. Do these remarkable similarities not give us definitive clues? ISIS, it is said, is a child of Wahhabism, and Wahhabism embodiment of a distinctive, literalist, anti-rationalist, hadith-centered, anti-kalam interpretation of Islam. Now, this, of course, we maintain this despite the fact that most Salafi and Wahhabi authorities, in fact, even Salafi jihadis, including al-Qaeda, theorists have vehemently, and as far as I've examined, consistently and systematically rejected ISIS's key claims and condemned its distinctive use of brutality and violence. Of course, this does not demonstrate that ISIS does not represent one plausible interpretation of Wahhabi or Salafi doctrine. But then, as Bernard Haeckel has famously argued, the same could be said of Islam in general. Wahhabism would appear to be simply a closer cousin of ISIS in the family of Islam. I want to show the futility of this type of argument by asking the question in another way. What is the class of phenomena of which ISIS is an instance? To illustrate, let's consider the following example. Imagine that a boy beat up another boy in the schoolyard. Let us say his father, when in the middle school, had a similar instance on record. Is it fair to say that the chief explanation for the kid's behavior is his genealogy, genetics, or family history? Or could we say equally that quarreling and bullying are something kids under certain conditions engage in everywhere? Given that the use of military violence to take over territories and exploit or establish new ideological regimes is not at all an exceptional phenomenon in history. In fact, it is the rule. So why single out this one boy's parents as a good explanation for his violence when boys do it all the time? Let's now consider the following scenario. A charismatic figure, that is in Islamic history, a charismatic figure on the margins of the Islamic world, agonized by the depraved condition of the community, calls for reviving the doctrine of Tawheed, of monotheism, unites tribes under his leadership to wage war against existing regimes and peoples for their loose practices, sternly and violently imposes moral norms, al-amru bil-ma'ruf wa nahy al-munkar, condemns taqlid, and most crucially calls his Muslim opponents disbelievers and uses that to declare jihad against them, condemns the doctrine of irja, or laxity towards sin. Ultimately, his successors succeed in establishing a powerful dynasty over a large and prosperous stretch of territory. If you thought that I'm describing Ibn Abdul Wahhab of Arabia in the 18th century, you guessed wrong. I had in mind another powerful reformer of the 12th century Maghreb, North Africa, that is al-Mahdi ibn Tumart. The self-appointed Mahdi, al-Mahdi al-Ma'soom, the infallible guided one. Ibn Tumart differed from Ibn Abdul Wahhab in only one chief respect. He was an Ash'ari, a student of Pro-Kalam al-Ghazali and of the Nizamiya Madrasa of Baghdad, and also a student, if you will, indirectly of Ibn Sina. And in contrast to Ibn Abdul Wahhab, who was inspired by the anti-Kalam or pro-Hadith traditionalist Ibn Taymiyyah. In fact, even the name the two charismatic reformers used for their movement was the same, al-Muwahhidun, the ones who hold to the doctrine of Tawheed. In both wings of Sunni Islam, therefore, that is the pro-Kalam and anti-Kalam, we have seen such movements. One may be tempted to say that it is just maybe the Sunnis, until then one considers the more radical Shiite militants, such as the Safavids and other Ghulat, who have Ghulat movements who have a similar history. And if we are tempted to blame Islam for this particular kind of ideological violence, we would do well to recall any number of modern revolutions and state formations. As Charles Tilly famously put it after his history of 1,000 years of state formation, that the rise of the modern nation state can be described as states make wars, wars make states, states make wars, and that's how states have become modernized. Or rather, wars make states, make wars make states. In other words, foundational violence, and we know this is at least since Machiavelli, foundational violence is a real thing. If we are tempted to blame what some might call closed societies, let's not forget the French Revolution. Just in 1 year of French Revolution, 30,000 people were executed, which is possibly more than ISIS's 10-year total. If such foundational violence is so common in history, again, what do we gain by comparing it to such manifestations in Islamic history, be it the Wahhabis, the Almohads, the Safavids, Abbasids, or Kharijis? I argue that we do gain something, but not what we often assume. In other words, when saying that, they're the Wahhabis or the Salafis, we don't understand what we think we understand, but rather this is the beginning of a kind of, if you will, an Islamic theory of foundational violence and how to, if you will, morally restrain it. So what I'm after, therefore, is a coherent and consistent normative framework within which to evaluate these similar but yet distinctive movements in Islamic history. I argue that such a framework exists and it is the job of those historians and scholars and theologians and jurists of Islam to advance such a framework while first drawing on it and learning from it. And that takes me to the fourth explanation, which is that the ISIS are the Khawarij. Now, of course, and for how much time do I have?
About 45 minutes, including questions.
And how far am I?
How long have you been talking for? 25 minutes.
Okay, wait, 20 more? I'll take 10 more, then open to questions. So, at first, when you hear the word, well, it is a Khawarij, it sounds like, number one, a cop-out. Number two, it's a movement that's been dead for, 1,200, 1,300 years. Why talk about it now? What does it even mean? It's completely ahistorical. And that's the point. It is ahistorical. Islamic theology is not a primarily historicist enterprise. In other words, there are what theologians very early on, as early as the Shahrastani, even earlier, began to say is that the movement that emerged in the wake of the Battle of Siffin between Ali and Muawiyah was, in fact, they came to be called the Khawarij, but they were a manifestation of a common problem that is possible, a certain kind of violent extremism whose traits are described, in fact, in hadith traditions, and it is famously, if you look at some of the more influential refutations of ISIS, the one that's most popular being Sheikh Muhammad al-Yaqubi, the Syrian jurist who has written this the refutation where he says they are the Khawarij. That is his fatwa. Although what he doesn't quite do is explain, so what then? That's because he understands that in Islamic tradition it is known and understood that once you classify someone as Khawarij, what does it do? What does it say? Well, for one, it says they are Khawarij and hence not Islamic, yet we are not necessarily saying they are not Muslim. In other words, let's look at the question. I'm not going to go into hadith and other detailed discussions. If you're interested, we can talk about the content of that charge. But I'm going to go back to the initial problem of what do we gain when we say that they are Khawarij. And what are the limitations of this charge? In other words, how far does it get us and what we still need to do? Bernard Haeckel in this famous, he's quoting this famous article in The Atlantic where he says, well, ISIS is as Islamic as anything else. Because, of course, he understands well that Islam is a discursive tradition. There are many different interpretations on any issue. In fact, the Sunni Islam, as we know, makes a virtue of it. There are 4 equally valid interpretations on any issue, and or madhabs that are, if you will, corporate entities. But there are many more opinions on an issue possible. And therefore, to say that something is wrong and I disagree with it, that's easy. To say that something is beyond the pale of any possible legitimate interpretation is very, 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 very difficult. To say that a claim made by a Muslim group in the name of Islamic texts, which they seem to know, more or less, is not Islamic is very difficult. Yet, it is possible only in this one instance when you say somebody is a Khariji. Because there is complete and unanimous agreement over it that developed in Islamic history and held by not only all Sunnis and Shia, but also by the later, if you will, descendants of Khawarij themselves, the Ibadis. Ibadi scholars themselves, incidentally, say that ISIS are Khawarij. And if you look at what they mean is they mean they're like the Azariqa, the bad Khawarij, not the good Khawarij. And so my objection to the claim that ISIS is just as Islamic as anybody else, because as a social scientist or as a historian or as an outsider, all I care about is what kind of claims they're making. And if it falls within, similar kinds of claims other Muslims are making, then they are Islamic. I would argue that if a tradition has consistently and unanimously rejected certain interpretations and certain acts as outside the pale, then there is a reason even for an outsider to take that claim seriously and say, well, yes, this is not Islamic, in the same way that many reasonable people could say that KKK's claims are not American. Although, right, you're right, I might say they're not Christian, but I think that patriotism is just as an important element of where they seek legitimacy. But the point I'm trying to make is there is a reason to say that. But then where does that leave us? If you look at the kind of justifications ISIS has and the reasons for both its rise and its success, it is a group that draws on very legitimate set of grievances. And the response, the rejection of these people as Khawarij comes from mouths, people that serve up, if you will, the tyrants who create the conditions. And this is if you talk to them, this is their major rebuttal. Who are you talking about? Who are these people who are calling us Khawarij? These people who are serving these rulers whom they excommunicate, but even if you don't excommunicate them, there is no doubt these people have committed great acts of violence, that most of these are illegitimate governments. And so there is a crisis of, if you will, a reasonable discursive solution, or at least a platform where the two sides can come together, because both sides, those who say that, well, you are Khawarij, and rightly so, I think, but also those who say that you are tyrants and oppressors, have a legitimate point. But more importantly, this asks us to asks us, if you will, this points us to the problem of legitimacy, and certainly a frenzied debate that has been going on for decades between reformists and traditionalists on whether modern nation state, whether democracy, constitutionalism, and so on are legitimate additions to the Islamic political apparatus. I think that debate is more important than ever before, and it needs to be taken more seriously. I think that those traditionalist scholars have failed to respond to the concerns that reformists have had. Yet at the same time, the reformers, by that I mean the tradition that starts with Muhammad Abdu, but includes such luminaries as Yusuf al-Qaradawi, that is present-day luminaries in Islamic jurisprudence, all of them continue to skirt certain central issues. And what they are, we can talk about it later, but I would leave it at that and look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.